So good morning. My name's Gabriele Ludwig. I'm Director for Environmental Policy with the Almond Board, or the Almond Board of California, depending on where you're from. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Roger.
Great. Good morning, everybody. There we go. All right. Now we're in business. Okay, so we're going to be talking about burrowing rodents today. So if we're talking about burrowing rodents, perhaps we ought to know a little bit about them as well. So I'm going to focus on three particular species today, those being California ground squirrels, pocket gophers, and then we'll talk a little bit about roof rats today too. So let's provide a little bit of background information as to these particular species. Like I said, one of the ones I want to talk about is the California ground squirrel. I'm sure you're all familiar with ground squirrels. They are grayish brown in color. They have a semi-bushy tail associated with them. They also have a mottled or speckled type appearance that you can use to differentiate them from some of the tree squirrel species that we have out there. Ground squirrels are a social species. That means they do live together in groups, so it makes it pretty easy for us to see them out there on the landscape and know that they're potentially causing problems. Now, as far as damage is concerned, they do like to girdle trees, so sometimes they'll climb up and start chewing on the branches, and if that occurs all the way around the branch, that can lead to mortality. They like to feed on nuts directly, obviously. They chew on irrigation lines. This is one of the more common types of damage we see from ground squirrels, results in many millions of dollars annually throughout the state. And then their abundant burrow openings cause all kinds of problems as well, whether that be tripping hazards, damage to farm equipment, increased soil erosion from water channeling down through burrow systems, etc. Now, ground squirrels are diurnal species. That means that they are active during the daytime. So again, pretty easy for us to see ground squirrels out there as opposed to some of the other rodent species, which are nocturnal and a little bit more challenging to see and identify. And as their name would imply, they do live in burrow systems. Sometimes those burrow systems are up and underneath structures. Obviously, when that happens, that's a problematic situation. But they also like to burrow alongside fence rows, roadsides, field edges, places like that. So those are good areas to key in on when looking for ground squirrel activity as it might move into a particular orchard. That being said, once they become established in an orchard, you can find their burrow systems just about anywhere. We're also going to talk a lot about gophers today. With pocket gophers, we're talking about burrowing rodents that are about 6 to 8 inches in length. Of course, I think we all know gophers spend the vast majority of their life below ground. So that means if we're going to identify gophers in a particular area, we have to look for some other form of sign. And the typical sign we're looking for with gophers are their mounds. Their mounds are usually horseshoe-shaped in appearance with a plug towards the lower end of one side of the mound. So if you look closely over here, you can see that horseshoe shape with a plug in the middle. Now, if we contrast that to mole mounds tend to be more conical or volcano-shaped in appearance with a plug either right in the middle of the mound, or sometimes we don't even see a plug associated with the mound. Now, it is important that you can differentiate between gophers and moles because these species are quite different and the management tools we use are quite different. So make sure you know which one you're dealing with there. As far as damage from gophers is concerned, probably the most common type of damage we see is direct feeding on the taproot of the plant, which can weaken and or kill that plant. But they can also girdle trees, usually below ground. Here's an example of what that girdling damage can look like. Even though it looks like it occurred above ground, it actually did occur below ground. We've just removed the soil from around the base of the tree to expose that girdling damage. And as you can imagine, this is a really difficult type of damage to deal with because you don't know that it's occurring until you start to see a loss in vigor of that particular tree. And at that point in time, it's probably too late. You're probably going to lose that tree. And odds are if it's happening to one, it's probably happening to multiples out there. So we can see pretty substantial losses, some combination of girdling and feeding on taproots of plants. Now, their mounds cause all kinds of issues too. Very similar to the types of issues we see with ground squirrel burrow systems, damage to farm equipment, tripping hazards to farm workers. Again, we see increased soil erosion concerns. Here's an example in a vineyard in Sonoma County where gophers had tunneled down that row and then water channeled down through it and led to pretty substantial erosion concerns. We can also see an increase in weed proliferation from the mounds, so basically bringing soil up to the surface that contains weed seed. And so we can see increased concerns there too. And the last one I'm going to talk about today is the roof rat. It's kind of the new hot topic over the last year or two, particularly in the southern portions of the Central Valley. Roof rats, are an invasive, non-native species. That being said, they've been here for centuries, so they're becoming pretty adapted to the systems that we're dealing with. They have large ears, long tails. They have longer tails than Norway rats, which we sometimes see in some of our urban centers, but not typically out in ag production areas. Roof rats are arboreal species. They climb really well. They spend a lot of their times up in trees, and so sometimes you will see nests up in the trees. This photo at the bottom right is an example of a nest in a citrus orchard. That being said, in almonds and most of our nut orchards, they really like to hang out in burrow systems as well. So if you walk around your orchards, if you have rats present, you'll notice some of these burrow systems like the one that you see at the bottom left. Now, damage from rats, it varies. Certainly, we do get, direct feeding on nuts, which can result in some losses there. I think probably a bigger concern is the girdling damage we see on the trees. That girdling damage, if it's extensive enough, can lead to mortality of that branch, and then, of course, you're losing production for the lifetime of that tree on that particular branch. So that can be very substantial. And then I think probably the greatest amount of damage that we're seeing from rats is just chewing on anything associated with water distribution, irrigation lines, things along those lines. Now, when it comes to managing these burrowing rodent species, we do recommend that you all utilize an integrated approach. And of course, with an integrated approach, we're talking about the use of multiple strategies. We generally find better results if we use multiple strategies than if we were to rely on any single one approach. Now, there's a variety of different tools that can be used to manage these species, and we'll be talking about a lot of those different tools as we go through our time here this morning. But one example could be if you had a very extensive gopher population, you could initially start off with a bait application to knock down that population and then follow that up with some other tool, perhaps trapping as an alternative follow-up approach. The important point to remember here, though, is that not all individuals in a population are going to be equally susceptible to any one of these tools. And so if we focus just exclusively on one tool, we're going to always miss a subset of that population. And for us to be most effective, we need to target all the individuals in that population. And the way to do that is to utilize multiple strategies. It's also important to understand a little bit about the biology of the species that we're trying to manage, as well as the ecology of the system that we're working in, as this can greatly influence the efficacy of our management programs as well. And I think this chart does a really good job of helping to illustrate this. This chart was designed specifically for the California ground squirrel. And what we see on this chart are major activity periods for ground squirrels, major food resources, and then the best time for control for three of the more commonly used strategies for managing ground squirrels. Now, of course, this is broken down across the different seasons of the year. So what do we notice when we look at this chart? Well, one of the things I notice is that there are two different food resources that ground squirrels rely on, but the reliance upon them varies depending upon what time of year it is we're dealing with. So when we come out of winter season into late winter, early spring, ground squirrels will emerge from hibernation, and what's available at that time is green foliage. This is important because if we think about some of the different baits that you might use for ground squirrel control, those baits are usually seed or pelletized type products, but they're not actively feeding on seeds until later in the year. So baiting typically does not work very well early in the year. It works well later in the year when they're actively feeding on seeds. So what might we do if we want to manage ground squirrels earlier in the year? One of the tools that we see that works really well at that time is burrow fumigation. And if we think about it, with burrow fumigants, for them to be effective, we need relatively high soil moisture. And in California, we're dealing with a Mediterranean climate. We get most of our precipitation in those winter through early spring months. That's when we have that high soil moisture. And so that's when these burrow fumigants work well. As we move into later times of the year, when those soils dry out, those fumigants no longer work very well. So these are just a couple of examples of how knowing a little bit about the biology of the species that we're trying to manage, as well as the ecology of the system that we're working in, can greatly influence the efficacy of our management programs. So with that, let's jump into a discussion about some of the different tools that are out there. This chart is just meant to give you an idea of what some of those different tools are. You see that some of them work for all the species we're talking about today. Habitat modification, baiting, burrow fumigation, trapping are all effective strategies for dealing with these species. Some of the other tools that we sometimes think about aren't as practical, at least on large-scale production ag situations, such as exclusion. So we're not going to talk about exclusion today. Frightening devices don't really work for these kinds of rodent species. Repellents, there is one repellent for pocket gophers that may have some utility for use in subsurface drip irrigation, but otherwise not a lot available for repellents. And then shooting is a potential option for ground squirrel control too, but it's usually too labor intensive and a little bit challenging in a orchard setting for it to be particularly practical. So we're not going to talk too much about that. But that being said, that previous chart was by no means meant to be all-inclusive. There are other tools out there that can be used to help manage these rodent species as well. And one of the tools we oftentimes hear talked about is biocontrol. With biocontrol, we're talking about the use of natural predation to help control pest populations. And when we think about burrowing rodents and we're thinking about biocontrol, the species that we're typically thinking about is the barn owl. Why do we focus on barn owls? Well, we focus on them for a couple of reasons. First of all, barn owls are very effective predators of small rodents. Depending upon the study that you see, which depends on the availability of rodents in a particular area, we see anywhere from 1,500 to 3,500 small rodents being consumed by a breeding pair of barn owls in a given year. So they are very effective predators of these small rodents. Secondly, we focus on barn owls because they are a relatively non-territorial species. This is important because that means we can artificially inflate their densities in a given area by putting up barn owl boxes. If we put up enough barn owl boxes, if we get good barn owl box occupancy, then we can get more predation or more pressure being exerted on those rodent populations in that particular area. So that hopefully will help us out. The big question, of course, is does it work? There's been a lot of work done in this area over the last few years. And basically what we're seeing is that barn owls can exert some negative pressure on some of these rodent populations out there. For example, we see anywhere from a 10 to 30% reduction in gopher populations following the implementation of barn owl boxes, at least in vineyards. Most of this work has been done in vineyards. We've also seen a positive effect of barn owls, or should we say a negative effect of barn owls on mouse populations. We don't have a lot of information about their effect on rat populations yet. This is an area we're keen on getting more information in, and hopefully we'll have some studies underway here in the near future looking at the potential for barn owls to help manage rats in almond orchards. But for now, we don't have a lot of information on that. But certainly there is the potential for barn owls to help control rat populations too. So, what we basically see with barn owls is, yes, they can have some impact on these rodent populations. Now, is that going to be enough to constitute effective management for these rodents? By itself, maybe not, but it certainly could be one part of an integrated approach for managing these rodent species. The last thing I'm going to mention, sometimes people talk about biocontrol with ground squirrels, and it's important to understand that barn owls are not going to have an impact on ground squirrel populations because, in part, ground squirrels are diurnal and barn owls are nocturnal. So they're not living in the same time frames there. So probably no substantial effect there. Could we rely on some of our diurnal raptors instead, some of the hawks and eagles and falcons out there? Maybe, but to date, there's really no data that shows, putting up raptor perches or anything like that is effective for ground squirrel control. Okay, how about some other tools? Habitat modification is another strategy that's sometimes mentioned. Certainly, habitat modification is a really good tool for helping to manage a lot of these rodent species, and it's one of the first tools I think that individuals should be thinking about when trying to develop an effective management program. There are a variety of potential strategies that can be incorporated into habitat modification. One of them is simply burrow destruction. If you think about it, you have ground squirrel populations in an area, you implement whatever strategies that you want to get rid of them. Even if you're wildly successful and you get rid of all the ground squirrels, you still have the old burrow systems out there. Those old burrow systems allow for rapid reinvasion. But if we can get rid of those old burrow systems, then we can substantially slow that reinvasion rate. And in fact, a predecessor of mine 30 plus years ago did some work on this and showed that by deep ripping old burrow systems down to 1.5 feet in depth, they were able to reduce reinvasion rates by 90%. So it does work very well. However, obviously, ripping to 1.5 feet in depth is very challenging in a lot of situations. And so it's not going to be practical in a lot of scenarios. But for example, if you had an orchard that had extensive ground squirrel populations, you're taking that orchard out and going to replant it, perhaps consider going through and ripping up those old burrow systems. That will give you a chance to start over, give you a clean slate, and make your management programs a little bit more effective. Another example of a cultural practice, if you will, that could help to manage rodent populations, unfortunately it's kind of a little bit askew, but I think you'll get the gist of it here, is flooding. Now, in a lot of cases, flood irrigation is impossible anymore. I understand that. But in some scenarios, they do maintain the capabilities for flood irrigation. And when you can, what this does is it brings those small rodents up to the surface where the predators can pick them off very effectively. And here's just a great example of what that can look like. Okay, moving on. I did also want to talk some about trapping today. Trapping is another tool that we commonly use to help manage some of these pest populations. Ground squirrels are an example of a species where we can utilize trapping to help manage them. There are a wide variety of different kinds of traps out there on the market, but we can basically lump them into two categories. Those are kill traps and live traps. Kill traps are just what the name would imply. They do kill the animal after capture. Examples of kill traps include body gripping traps such as the Conibear 110 that we see here at the top right. Place that in a burrow entrance and it can capture the ground squirrel when it runs in or out of those burrow systems. We also have tube or tunnel style traps which can be used along runways that can be effective for catching ground squirrels. There's box type squeeze traps that are also kill traps which can be used. There's also automatic repeating traps now, such as the Good Nature A18, which will automatically reset after a capture. So these are all examples of kill traps. Like I said, the benefit of them is that they do kill the animal after capture, but the downside of them is that they can be indiscriminate. So if you capture a non-target animal in a trap like this, it could kill it as well. So if you're trapping in areas where you're concerned about non-target captures, then you might want to consider utilizing the live traps instead. Here's an example of a live trap, your standard have-a-heart or tomahawk style traps, which capture the ground squirrel inside and keep it alive so that, if you captured somebody's cat, for example, you can just open up the door and release it. There are also multi-catch traps out there which allow you to capture multiple ground squirrels at once that are live traps too. Now, the downside of these live traps, though, is that if you do target the animal, you are responsible for euthanizing the animal after capture. This is an important step that everybody always needs to understand before they start implementing these traps. You can't go use these traps, catch the ground squirrel, and then go, now what do I do? You have to know ahead of time what you're going to do. And what you can't do is take it somewhere else and release it. That's called translocation, and translocation of wildlife is illegal in the state of California. So if you are going to use these, you do need to be prepared to euthanize the animal after capture. There are two techniques currently considered humane by the American Vet Association that would be appropriate for use in this particular scenario. One of them is shooting. So if you're in an area where you can legally discharge a firearm, then you can use that to dispatch the animal. But in a lot of cases, that's not practical. In those scenarios, you might instead utilize a carbon dioxide euthanasia chamber, which is a device that allows you basically to just put the trap inside and then pump CO2 into it. It can be pretty simple. Here's an example of a toolbox where you just put the trap inside. It's got a hole drilled into the side. You then pump carbon dioxide into it at a specified flow rate that causes the animal to pass out and then eventually succumb to that exposure. So this is usually the more preferred method. for euthanizing ground squirrels in these kinds of live traps. Just be aware, the last thing I'll mention on this, sometimes people ask about drowning. Drowning is not considered a humane form of euthanasia, but more importantly, in the state of California, it is not legal to euthanize animals via drowning. So that's not really an option. Okay, we can also utilize trapping for gopher control. In fact, I think trapping is one of the best tools we have out there for gopher control. A little bit more challenging for ground squirrels, I think easier to implement for gophers. A wide variety of different kinds of traps out there on the market. Some of these are pincher-style traps. Examples of pincher-style traps include the Maccabee, which has been around for well over 100 years. The cinch trap's been around for about 100 years. The Gophinator's been around for quite a while. But there's a lot of other traps too, including the Victor Easy Set, the Johnson's Quick Set, the DK1, a wide variety of these. Then we have box-type squeeze traps, such as the Victor Black Box. That's an example of a squeeze-type trap. There's the Gopher Hawk. Some of you may be familiar with that. That's more reminiscent of a squeeze-type trap as well. A lot of questions about which trap works best. There has been some testing done on this over the years. In particular, I've done some fairly extensive testing comparing the Maccabee trap to the Gophinator trap. And what we ended up finding out is that the Gophinator trap actually worked better, and it worked better because it allowed us to capture larger gophers at a greater rate, and that's what this chart here at the bottom left is showcasing, basically illustrating that as you get into the larger and larger size classes, the Gophinator trap, which is represented by the solid line, resulted in a greater number of captures. So the Gophinator does seem to be a really good trap. We've also gotten a lot of questions over the years about the importance of covering trap sets, or if you could leave those trap sets uncovered. By covering a trap set, you're creating the illusion that there's nothing wrong in the tunnel system. So hopefully you catch a gopher at a high rate. Conversely, you could leave those trap sets open, and that in theory could encourage investigation of those sites by gophers. Gophers do not like openings in their tunnel systems, so they notice that, they're going to want to come and plug that up. And that might allow them to get captured at a greater rate. So we've tested this pretty extensively as well and found out in the end it really didn't matter that much either way. So you can utilize covered trap sets, you can utilize them uncovered, just depends on your personal preference. If I'm trapping over large areas, I usually utilize open trap sets just to save myself some time. But if you're trapping in areas where you're concerned about non-target access to those traps, then you can cover those up and they will work just as well. We've also looked at a variety of different kinds of attractants and whether or not that can increase trapping success. We've not found any real benefit to utilizing any attractants, so I don't think you need to use anything there. We've also looked at human scent and if that impacts our ability to catch gophers, and in reality, it did not. So if you want to handle the traps with your bare hands, that's fine. So, to this point, we've talked a lot about strategies for increasing the effectiveness of trapping programs, but we still haven't talked about how effective they actually are. Turns out trapping for gophers is highly effective. We've looked at it in both wine grapes and in alfalfa fields, and in both cases, we've seen 92 to 94% removal rates after 2 trapping sessions. So trapping really is a very efficacious tool when it comes to managing gopher populations. Now, we can also utilize trapping to manage rat populations too. One common approach is to utilize snap traps. We've done a lot of testing utilizing these trapping tunnels. These are tunnels that have a couple of snap traps inside them and then place them up in the canopy of the trees. These have worked really well for us. They've substantially reduced rat populations in citrus orchards at least, and we're looking at them in almond orchards right now. There's another kind of trap that's out there too. I mentioned a little bit about the automatic repeating trap for ground squirrels, where there's another version called the A24 that's available for roof rats. It's a CO2 fired trap with a long-lasting lure at the top. The rat's supposed to smell it, stick its head up. It triggers the trap, which releases a burst of CO2, which in turn releases a bolt, which crushes the skull of the rat, kills it almost instantly, and then resets itself. So the rat falls out, scavengers come along, remove the rat, and it resets itself. So it's pretty handy from that perspective. We have tested it pretty extensively in citrus orchards though, and unfortunately our results were not super great. It didn't really work very well. The snap traps worked a lot better for us. But it is out there. They do kill the rats. If you catch them, it's going to kill them. The question is whether or not we can entice them to go into the trap, and to date we've had some challenges with that. But they are out there, and they are an option. Okay, I did want to talk about bait application as well. Of course, with baiting, we're talking about the use of toxic baits to help control rat populations. Rodent populations. I'm so focused on rats these days. There are a few different types of rodenticides that can be used. There are the first generation anticoagulants, which are chronic feed materials. Basically, the animal needs to consume that bait over the course of several days to get a lethal dose. And then we also have acute toxicants, which kill the animal after a single feed. Those would include zinc phosphide and strychnine. Now, all of these products for use in production ag systems these days are restricted use products. So you do have to be certified to use them. There are some pretty substantial changes that have either been enacted or are in the works for some of these particular products. We're going to talk a little bit about that now. We're going to talk a little bit about that in some of our additional talks here today. But suffice it to say that for the first generation anticoagulants, which include difascinone, chlorfascinone, and warfarin, there is a moratorium on their use in the state of California as of this point. That being said, there are some exemptions. There are some carve-outs for use, and production ag situations are one of those exemptions. So if you have an almond orchard and you have ground squirrels or rats, and you want to use these products to manage ground squirrels or rats in those systems, they are still an option for you. So be aware of that, at least as of right now. This is all subject to change. As far as the products that are available for ground squirrels, we can use first generation anticoagulants and zinc phosphide. Same thing for roof rats. For gophers, we have one additional option, and that is strychnine. Now, how do we apply these products? Well, they can be applied in one of three methods. Those are spot treatments, broadcast applications, or in bait stations. Spot treatments are used when you have just a few burrow systems to treat. In that case, you follow the label specifications. Each label can be different, but in general, they they state the use of 1/3 cup of bait spread over a 40 to 50 square foot area. So if you think about that, 40 to 50 square feet it's a pretty good sized area. So 1/3 cup of bait spread over that area should result in about, let's say 6 to 8 pieces of grain per square foot. So if we look at that photo at the bottom left, we can clearly notice that somebody hasn't followed label specifications there, all right? What they've done is they've piled up bait around those burrow entrances. And when they do that, that is a very hazardous situation. Because when you do that, now all kinds of animals can come along and consume enough of that bait to get a lethal dose. But if it's only a few pieces of grain per square foot, there are not very many animals adapted to be able to pick up enough of that to get a lethal dose, which is why that has been an allowable technique for a number of years. Now, that being said, for almond orchards, production season, bearing season, this is something you wouldn't be able to use. But it is commonly used around the perimeters of orchards if you have a few burrow systems to treat. Likewise, you can utilize a broadcast application, which is where you have a seed spreader that's been properly calibrated to spread the bait at a specified flow rate. Again, we're shooting for a target of 6 to 8 pieces of grain per square foot. These are sometimes used along orchard perimeters, but that would be the extent to where they are primarily used. The more common strategy for applying bait in orchards is the use of bait stations. Here we have one of our typical upside-down T-shaped bait stations, which of course allow access to bait only by those animals small enough to enter into that bait station. Like I said, these are more commonly used in orchard settings. Just keep in mind, though, with these first-generation anticoagulant products, like I said, they are chronic feed materials. That means the animal does need to consume the bait over the course of several days to get a lethal dose. So if you're using spot treatments or broadcast applications, that means you have to do a follow-up application, usually 4 days after the initial application, although the label will tell you exactly what you need to do. And even with bait stations, you need to check the bait stations and make sure that they're maintaining a constant bait supply. Because if the animals eat it all in a day or two, then they're not getting access to it again on days 3, 4, and 5, which are needed to maximize the effectiveness of that approach. Okay, we can also use zinc phosphide, which is an acute toxin. Again, it does kill after a single feed, so we have more rapid knockdown associated with it. It also does not have secondary exposure risk, which the first generation anticoagulants can have, which is why there's increased restrictions on its use these days. So there are some potential benefits to the use of zinc phosphide, but it also has a distinctive odor and taste that animals don't always necessarily like. So sometimes a ground squirrel might feed on a couple pieces of grain, but that's it. That would be enough to cause them to get sick, but not enough to kill them. And then they would learn to avoid feeding on that product again in the future. So one way we can overcome some of these issues is to pre-bait. Pre-baiting is where you take non-toxic bait, you spread it out there in the same manner that you would the toxic bait. If the ground squirrels feed on it, then you can follow that up with a zinc phosphide application. But if they don't feed on it, then there's no point in following it up with a zinc phosphide application because they're not going to feed on that either. So that's one way we can overcome that. Now for zinc phosphide, we're generally only using this for spot treatments or broadcast applications. Most labels do not allow for use in bait stations, principally because we thought that the bait station would magnify that odor to the point that the animal wouldn't want to consume it. But I have been doing some trial work on it, and it actually has been working better in bait stations than I thought it would. So perhaps there may be some opportunities to get that added to the labels in the future. We'll see. Lastly, because zinc phosphide is an acutely toxic material, it's not for use in or around buildings. So keep that in mind, read the labels, and make sure you're following those specifications there. For roof rats, we can also use bait application. With roof rats, what we're using are elevated bait stations, these tubular style bait stations placed up in trees with the bait inside. In this case, it's a very specific product. It's a 0.005% diphacinone product that's sold by some of the county ag commissioners' offices. This is currently the only bait that's available for use within orchards during the bearing season for rat control. So if you're going to utilize this strategy, you have to use that product in an elevated bait station like this. It does work quite well. We've seen 73% efficacy against roof rats in citrus orchards, and that was with 165-foot spacing. We shrunk that distance between bait stations in almond orchards, and we had better results, 90% efficacy with 100-foot spacing there. So it does work really well for rat control. But again, it must be used in those elevated bait stations. And then for gophers, we can use bait as well. We can use strychnine, we can use first generation anticoagulants, we can use zinc phosphide. But I can tell you from extensive study myself, as far as a lot of other researchers out there, strychnine works by far the best. It's by far the most efficacious for gopher control. The other products, although available, really don't work all that well against gophers. They work well against other species, but less so for gophers. So I would certainly steer you towards strychnine if you're going to use bait for managing gophers. For application strategies, the old funnel and spoon method works fine in your backyard, but probably a little labor intensive for an orchard setting. In orchards, more commonly, we use one of these all-in-one probe and bait dispensers, which allow you to probe directly into the tunnel and then crank a lever, which deposits a preset amount of bait into the tunnel system. And then in some cases, if you had very extensive gopher populations, you could use a burrow builder, which creates an artificial tunnel and deposits bait at set intervals within that tunnel, so that when the gopher travels around, comes across that tunnel, travels down it, and has access to that bait. This approach is certainly the quickest and easiest approach here, the burrow builder, but it's also a little bit more hit or miss. It doesn't always necessarily work quite as well as some of the other tools. And then the last strategy I wanted to talk about today were the burrow fumigants. We've hit on this a little bit, but with burrow fumigation, for it to be effective, we need that high soil moisture. When we have that high soil moisture, it closes off those pores and cracks in the gas and holds those toxic gases in at a greater rate. So that means usually works best, right, in late winter, early spring for gophers. and then any time after ground squirrels emerge from hibernation. Just realize they have to be active. We don't want to apply the Borough fumigants when ground squirrels are hibernating, because when they hibernate, they have a nesting chamber that they plug themselves up into, and then those gases can't get to them for it to work. So they do need to be active. As far as rats are concerned, we really don't have a lot of data on the effectiveness of Borough fumigants against rats, but I'm going to be running some tests this winter. So hopefully in the near future we'll have more information on that. The last thing for this first slide here with Borough fumigants, just keep in mind they should never be used, immediately adjacent to these buildings. We don't know where these burrow systems go. Sometimes those burrow systems go up and underneath structures. And if that's the case and we utilize Borough fumigants, then those gases could leak up and cause problems for humans or domestic animals. How close you can be to a building depends on the product that you're using and the species that you're applying it for. So always check the labels because it can vary there. As far as our options, we do have gas cartridges. I always think of these as a glorified smoke bomb. You light a fuse, you shove it into the burrow system, creates a lot of smoke, a lot of carbon monoxide, which can asphyxiate the animal. Works well for ground squirrels. It's labeled for gophers, but it doesn't work very well for gophers. So we don't really rely on their use for gophers much, but it does work well for ground squirrels. The nice thing about gas cartridges is that they are not a restricted use product, so you don't have to be a certified applicator to utilize them. Another option is aluminum phosphide, phostoxin, fumitoxin, weavicide are all examples. These are tablets or pellets that you put into the burrow system which react with moisture in the burrow system to create phosphine, which is a gas that's toxic to the animal. This is a highly efficacious tool. We see 97 to 100% efficacy of ground squirrel burrow systems when treated with this, 90 to 100% efficacy for gopher populations. However, this is also by far the most restrictive of all the products that are out there. You certainly have to be a certified applicator in order to utilize this product, but you also will have to file a notice of intent, a pesticide use report, you have to file a fumigation management plan, you have to post sites for 48 hours, or you may have to wear a phosphine detector when utilizing it. So there are a lot of restrictions associated with it, but it's highly efficacious. And so if you're somebody who has consistent problems with gophers and ground squirrels, and potentially rats too, then it's a really good tool. Just be aware if you've used aluminum phosphide in the past but haven't used it recently, there is also a new certification category that's needed in order to be able to utilize that. For those of you with the QAC or QAL, you now have to take the Category M certification. And for PACs, you have to complete a 45-question test called Burrowing Vertebrate Fumigation Category. So there's an extra hoop there to jump through if utilizing aluminum phosphide. Other fumigation options include carbon monoxide machines or pressurized exhaust machines, such as the PERC machine and the Kojak, which allow you to treat multiple burrow systems at once. If you're looking for a cheaper option, there's the Burrow RX, which allows you to treat one burrow system at a time, as well as the Cheetah rodent controller. We've done a fair amount of testing on these. Oops, I guess I don't have that slide for this. We have done a fair amount of testing on these. In particular, a lot of testing on the PERC machine. We found that it works pretty well for gopher control. I'd say 60 to 65% efficacy. And it works really well for ground squirrel control. We've had 100% efficacy in ideal moist soil conditions and even close to 70% efficacy in dry soil conditions when other Borough fumigants generally would not work well at all. So I do think that these are pretty good tools for gopher and ground squirrel control. Again, we don't have data on rats yet. And the last one is a carbon dioxide injection device. We do have an option there now called the Eliminator. For this, you have to have a canister of carbon dioxide in order to inject it into the burrow system. That means you're utilizing carbon dioxide as a pesticide, which means it has to be specifically labeled as a pesticide in order to use it. So you can't grab the CO2 tank from your kegerator and run out and use it. Okay, you have to go somewhere and buy specifically labeled CO2 for this. And there are not a lot of places that sell it. So before you run right out and buy one of these devices, make sure you have a supply of that available for you. As far as effectiveness, there hasn't been a lot of testing, but the testing I have seen suggests it's probably fairly similar to that for the pressurized exhaust machines. Okay, so that's the material I had today. I want to leave you with a couple of resources, though, for ground squirrel questions. Please check out the Ground Squirrel Best Management Practices website. Contains lots of great information. For the other species, or in particular, I'm sorry, for pocket gophers, check out the Vertebrate Pest Control Handbook, which has lots of great information. And then for roof rats, I'll direct you toward this UC-ANR publication on managing roof rats and deer mice in nut and fruit orchards. Lots of great information there, although we're also working on an updated version of this, which hopefully will be available within the next few months, which will contain a lot of new information. Okay, I don't think we have time for questions right now. We're going to save that for the end. So thank you, and look forward to your questions later.
Just a reminder, if you want to ask questions, capture this QR code. We're now going to switch gears and start talking about some of the regulatory issues. And I also wanted to let people know, for those of you who have the roof rat problem, there are some bait stations examples in the corner. There are only 2 available, but there's a QR code there to put in orders to get some for free. And if you want more than a certain amount, I think it's more than 10, you have to start paying. But just to let you know, we have some help, and that's thanks to CAPCA's efforts with Roger's work. Now to Elana.
Alrighty, good morning everyone. For today's talk, I'll be presenting DPR's proposed anticoagulant rodenticide mitigations that were shared out at DPR's informal public workshop at the end of September this year. In this presentation, I will give make sure I have there we go. I'll start this presentation with a high-level overview of anticoagulant rodenticides, which I'll refer to as ARs for short. Then DPR's proposed mitigations in broad strokes, followed by current AR restrictions based on legislative action. And then the remainder of the presentation will be a more detailed walkthrough of DPR's draft regulations, which have, again, been posted online for public consideration. At the end, I'll go over details of a recent 45-day informal comment period, which has now closed November 8th, and specific aspects where DPR was looking for feedback on the draft regulations. Lastly, I'll go over next steps to expect from here. Okay, so starting with an overview of ARs. ARs are a chemical class of pesticide that prevent blood clotting, leading to uncontrolled hemorrhaging and toxicosis. There are 2 subclasses of ARs, namely second-generation anticoagulant rodenticides, or SGARs for short, that include the 4 active ingredients listed here, and first-generation anticoagulant rodenticides, or FGARs, with 3 FGAR active ingredients listed here as well. Please note that the active ingredients listed in bold are currently under DPR's formal reevaluation process. DPR's proposed mitigations would include all first and second generation ARs, including the 2 first generation ARs that are not in bold on the slide. And DPR is taking this holistic approach due to concerns of the effects on wildlife. Specifically, that ARs can take several days to be effective and may persist in the body for years as a result. As a result, predatory animals can accumulate ARs over time. DPR's proposed mitigation aims to reduce impacts to wildlife and maintain necessary uses of ARs. More specifically, the proposed mitigations aim to reduce repeat exposure events of non-target wildlife for all ARs by 1, reducing the overall amount of ARs in the environment, and 2, reducing how long ARs are available in the environment. The focus is on reducing repeat exposures because studies show this is what is especially harmful to wildlife. Additional proposed requirements involve educating users on sustainable rodent management via education and a sustainable rodent management plan. Okay, so those are the broad strokes. Now, how is DPR proposing to do this? That would be via new regulations. DPR's draft proposed regulations, again, have been posted online, so you can see them in full there. And the draft proposed regulations would do the following. They would classify all ARs as restricted materials. So individuals must be licensed pesticide applicators in order to purchase ARs. And this classification really just aligns what's currently in statute, as Roger mentioned previously, with the broader regulatory structure. It limits where ARs can be used to uses that protect public health, agriculture, and water-related infrastructure. It limits applications to a maximum of 35 consecutive days at most sites, with a maximum of 105 days annually per site for any AR. It requires training on sustainable rodent management that includes rodent biology, secondary exposure risk and non-target wildlife effects, and choosing the right tool for managing rodents. Lastly, the draft regulations would require businesses or private applicators to develop a sustainable rodent management plan that addresses how the business or private applicator would approach rodent management decision-making. Now, the previous slide mentioned application duration limits per site. So what is a site? For reference, the term site is used throughout DPR's regulations, and the proposed regulations would use them similarly here. Additionally, existing product labels specify sites where a product can be used. And going a step more, DPR's draft regulations would further restrict sites where in and around man-made structures, ARs can be used, and restrict use to within 50 feet of the structures. The draft regulations also specify when and where, in specific circumstances, use would be exempt from the proposed restrictions. So before I go into further detail on the proposed restrictions, I want to take a moment to talk about what's currently required via legislation and what that landscape looks like. So anticoagulant rodenticides are called out in section 12978.7 of the California Food and Agricultural Code, which contains use restrictions, considerations for DPR's reevaluation process, the concurrence requirements with the California Department of Fish and Wildlife. Chronology of the bills is shown below, resulting in the use of all ARs, as in all FGARs and SGARs, being prohibited at certain sites. Now, this FAC section is in place until the department certifies that it has completed the reevaluation process and adopted restrictions in consultation with and with the concurrence of the Department of Fish and Wildlife. DPR expects the draft regulations discussed today to replace the restrictions currently in statute once adopted as final. Okay, current restrictions in the Food and Ag Code designate that applications are only allowed by exempted users at exempted use sites. While the allowed use sites in legislation provided a touch point, DPR identified and evaluated sites based on their necessity in protecting human health. DPR's list was further refined over the course of multiple conversations with stakeholders. As mentioned before, the proposed mitigation would specify man-made structures where ARs can be used via site definitions in statute, limit duration of use, and require applicator training and development of a sustainable road management plan. So now I'll go through each of those components listed here in more detail. Starting with allowed uses at man-made structures, this would only be permitted at listed sites. So again, DPR selected sites based on protecting public health, with refinement from stakeholder input, and these sites would be subject to the 35-day and 105-day use duration restrictions which I'll review in detail in the next slide. Other uses, including FGAR use in agriculture, as previously mentioned, public health, water supply, protecting endangered species, and research that meets statutory definitions would be exempt from the duration restriction as well. So for allowed man-made sites critical for public health, a limit on the duration of baiting would apply. This is that 35 consecutive days for any AR application. And 2 additional 35-day applications would be permitted per year for a cumulative annual total of 105 days per site. Registrant submitted data indicate that this time frame is effective, with studies showing a 70% reduction in rodent populations in 35 days. And this duration limit is more restrictive than the continuous baiting, or 365 days, currently allowed, and would reduce the overall amount of ARs in the environment and minimize exposure to non-target wildlife. Proposed exemptions from the site and duration restrictions would include public health needs as declared by state public health officers and use by vector control, non-native invasive species eradication on offshore islands, CDFW, invasive rodent population eradication to protect endangered species and habitats, protecting water and hydroelectric infrastructure, and FGAR use in agriculture, as well as research for continuous evaluation purposes. So to reiterate, FGAR use in agriculture, which is currently an allowed use, would remain unchanged with this proposal, and there would be no limit on the duration of use either. As previously mentioned, reduced use is critical to protecting non-target wildlife and will help ensure effective pest management, critical to addressing rodent management more holistically. To support this, the draft mitigation includes a training requirement for all AR applicators and development of a sustainable rodent management plan for businesses and private applicators. It is important to note that these would be required via restricted materials use requirements. For the sustainable rodent management training, all applicators, again, would be required to take an annual training in addition to general licensing and continuing education requirements. This training would increase awareness and adoption of IPM and sustainable pest management practices and complement the proposed site and duration restrictions by ensuring all applicators are informed of viable alternatives to ARs. Accordingly, the course would include integrated pest management and sustainable pest management as defined in the Food and Ag Code. With the draft regulations as currently written, there are a couple of options for how the training could be implemented, and DPR asked for public feedback on which of the following options might be the best fit in that public comment period I previously mentioned. And that include whether the training should be DPR provided versus DPR approved. And DPR also wanted to understand how important it is for users for the training to count towards continuing education credits for both DPR and Structural Pest Control Board licensees. As a reminder, this training would be required via restricted materials use requirements. However, DPR has met with the Structural Pest Control Board and is currently evaluating how the training could fit into their CEs, as well as ours. Therefore, DPR asked for feedback on the relative importance of the training counting towards CEs. But again, implementation details are outside of the scope of the rulemaking process. As I mentioned before, that comment period is now closed, and DPR is currently working through the comments received. The last proposed requirement is a sustainable rodent management plan. Each pest control business would be required to write, implement, and retain records of a sustainable rodent management plan prior to any use of ARs. If applications are done by an operator of the property, for instance, a private applicator, rather than a pest control business, the plan requirements would fall to them. Resultantly, this requirement also applies to agricultural settings. The plan is intended to be a general plan, not site-specific. This business-wide plan is intended to be used as a decision-making tool for each site, not as a prescribed set of actions for every specific scenario. The list of aspects required in the plan generally mirrors the sustainable rodent management training, and the plan is intended to sort of dovetail with and help applicators implement the training. DPR expects the training and plan will both help ensure appropriate continued use of ARs. The Sustainable Rodent Management Plan also has a record-keeping requirement where site-specific use records must be kept at a central business location and track the dates ARs are deployed and collected at each site in order to help support compliance with that 35-day use limit. Okay, so that concludes the sort of overview of DPR's draft proposed regulations. These are the agencies that we've worked closely with so far in creating the draft mitigations, including CDFW, CDFA, SPCB, and CDPH. So a quick thank you to them. The draft proposed regulation posted online has the comment period that has closed, but for reference for you all today, in addition to general comments, DPR also sought feedback on the following. Does the rulemaking text capture the intent of the mitigation as explained here today? Refinements to the exempted sites, the training topics and implementation options that I walked through in a previous slide. And for site-specific use duration record keeping, if keeping the records at a central business location was the best option. The current proposal also has a 12-month delay between the effective date of the regulations and when the training would be required to be completed by in order to provide applicators time to comply. And DPR also asked for feedback on this buffer length. Okay, for next steps from there, DPR's draft proposal, again, I invite you to look at that via our website, and there is a link here as well. And although the informal comment period is closed, I'm looking forward to hearing your questions here today and taking them back internally. And for any clarifying questions that you might have that I'm not able to answer today, please feel free to send them to the email denoted on the slide here, which is rodenticide.comments@cdpr.ca.gov. And with that, thank you all for your time today, and I'll pass the mic back over to Gabrielle.
So I'm going to take the moderator's prerogative and put you a bit on the spot and just make sure I can summarize this correctly. So as proposed right now, the timing limitations, the 35-day limitations, and only doing it twice per year would not apply, because difasinon is the main product we're talking about from an almond perspective, would not apply for applying in the field for precision agricultural use.
Correct.
Okay. But then any of the trainings, the restricted use, the having a sustainable pest management plan, all of that would apply regardless of where you're using it.
Yes.
And then rodenticides aren't only used in the field, but they're also used around food processing facilities. So for us, it's the huller shellers and the almond handlers or processors. Where do they fit between the 35-day yes or no?
That depends on the definition of the facility. For permanent food facilities and food processing facilities, those are I want to say the 35-day limit Yes, yeah, those have to abide by the 35 and 105-day limit. And then FGAR used at locations for producing, storing, holding, agricultural commodities. So FGARs specifically would be exempt.
So, and again, for us, it's difasinon, which would be one of the first generation anticoagulants. So just to summarize that, changing gears, and I just want to be prefaced, I am not EPA, I'm Almond Board of California, but I work a lot in the regulatory space, and I just wanted to give you a sense of a parallel regulatory process that's going on at the federal level. And really, a lot of the issues are the exact same ones that they're trying to mitigate, but the context in which it's happening is different than what DPR's context is. The issue is the same, which is there's a lot of concern about these rodenticides affecting what's the technical term is non-target species, meaning you saw those pictures of raptors and raccoons and things like that that eat the dead or dying rodent and in that process take in the rodenticide, which then affects them. And there's stories in the media, I don't know if you remember this, but there was a non-native owl that escaped the zoo in the Central Park and was flying around New York City, and everybody was following it, and eventually got run over. And when they did toxicology tests, they found rodenticides in it. So just to give you a sense of where that conversation is in that larger picture about where this worry is coming from, the same thing's been with mountain lions and coyotes and stuff like that. For EPA, the big driver right now, and this is actually for all pesticides, not just rodenticides, is actually how to get in compliance with the Endangered Species Act. And I'm going to go a bit in the weeds right now, but basically the issue is in the way the Endangered Species Act was written is anytime a federal agency makes a decision, they actually need to take a look and say, could this somehow affect an endangered species or the habitat of endangered species? And if yes, then they need to consult, depending on the species, with the Fish and Wildlife Service or the National Marine Fisheries Service. Now the problem is, even though EPA in their risk assessments has always looked at what's the potential impact of endangered species, they haven't done what's called this consultation, which is, if it could, that they've actually consulted with the Fish and Wildlife Service or the National Marine Service, AKA services. So more than 25 years ago, an NGO figured out that this might be the case, sued EPA, EPA lost, and this was during the Bush II administration. That basically this fundamental issue that at that time, not a single pesticide, registered pesticide, met the letter of the law, not the intent of the law, the letter of the law for the Endangered Species Act. And since then, there's been additional lawsuits driving EPA in terms of which pesticides they look at under the ESA. And when I say they need to look at it, that typically means the initial lawsuits were like in the Pacific Northwest for certain species. And then we had one in California for like 12 species in California. But more recently, it's been like you need to look at every species between Maine and the Mariana Islands and every habitat between them. That's a lot of work to do, okay? So in the 20 years since this legal vulnerability has shown up, each administration's been trying to figure out what do we do about it, and nothing's working because it's so much work. Neither EPA nor the services have the resources on this. And then the biggest driver was the Center for Biological Diversity did a lawsuit where they basically said these 400 pesticides registrations needs to be pulled, and these are all the pesticides that you mainly use because none of them meet the ESA, and EPA is just not doing anything about it. That kind of got everybody's attention when both registrants and EPA. So in the Biden administration, they made an agreement and essentially are doing what are called strategies. And essentially what they're trying to do is they're putting on mitigation measures onto the labels in advance so that then when EPA does this biological evaluation, there'll be a lot fewer what are called may affect findings and a lot fewer of the potential jeopardy findings. So the amount of consultation is going to go down. But you will start seeing, and this again, this isn't just for rodenticides, you will start seeing, it's starting as either something new gets registered or Section 18, or as it comes to registration review, you'll start seeing label language around Endangered Species Act, and what exactly you need to do will depend on a lot of things, and it's a whole nother conversation I'm not going to go into right now about how to interpret it. So for rodenticides, as part of these legal, as I say, there were lawsuits specifically requiring EPA to do these biological evaluations by certain deadlines for all the rodenticides. In this case, it's 11 of them that they're looking together. And again, we've heard about them from both speakers. And similar to what DPR is saying, as I say, the main concern is really non-target species exposure. But I mean, the other exposures that EPA has already been mitigating has been worrying about exposures for kids and pets for rodenticide uses in homes. But I'd say the other big worry for rodenticides, just generally speaking. Okay, my power is not with me. Guys, can you move the slides forwards? For some reason, it's not working right now. Thank you. So just to give you a sense, the other thing that's driving it is EPA every 15 years is required to review any pesticides that have been registered. They need to re-review because there could be new data indicating either new risks that they hadn't considered beforehand. In a few cases, the risk is not as bad as you thought, but generally it's that there's something new that they're worrying about. And that's called registration review. So the first registration review got completed in 2008, and again, most of those mitigations were around what I consider home use. If you've bought any traps or any baited stations at home, you used to be able to just get the bait and put it in a trap. Good luck doing that now, and now if you're not having two fingers in the right places, you're never going to get that bait back in there or out. So all of those are mitigation measures that came out of that 2008 mitigation. Slides. And then more recently, again, EPA's first step is to do that registration review process, and they've been doing that, and that's basically completed. And then they've also been doing they did a draft biological evaluation, and then in parallel did this strategy for what are generic mitigation measures that could be applied to try and minimize the chances that there would be an impact on non-target and particularly endangered species. So in 2023, the draft biological evaluation came out and had a lot of potential impacts, and then in 2024, the final one came out, and basically by adding in these mitigation measures, they're basically saying they only have to do this consultation now on some 5% of the listed species and less than 1% of the critical habitat. So currently the ball's now in the Fish and Wildlife Services Court. They need to review the evaluation by EPA and say, do they agree with it? Do they think the mitigation measures are good enough? Or in some cases they've come back and said, I don't think we actually need as much as you think. So that's where things are right now. And as I say, in parallel, they released this rodenticide strategy, which is a list of mitigation measures. I don't know exactly, last I heard, for each individual rodenticides, that registration review was supposed to be completed by this coming year. I haven't heard anything recently, so I don't know when these mitigation measures are actually going to be showing up on labels. Next slide, please. And this is just to give you a sense of the kinds of mitigations that are in this strategy. So similar to what DPR is saying, is everything become restricted use material, except for some very limited uses for home uses where you can't sell large volumes. Restrict the use of bait stations to only those that exclude specific species, listed species, prohibition on broadcast, and some below-ground burrowed applications, which that would be a pretty big deal for us based on what we just heard from Roger. Restricting the bait station placement to that it needs to be close to buildings if you're near buildings, so that you, again, minimize the chance that endangered species would be around. One of the things that in the initial BE they proposed is that for 14 days you would have to daily go out and look for carcasses and remove them. We all had a heart attack at that one. especially because it included zinc phosphide and others where you're like, that's not relevant. Post-application follow-up statements for bait spills, bait kickout. Roger just mentioned you should probably be doing that just for efficacy reasons, not just for that reasons. Prohibiting its use in certain times of years depending on when endangered species may be active or some things like that. So it just gives you a sense of the potential mitigation measures that will be showing up on rodenticides. And I really should say for us in almonds, it's difascinone, which is a first generation anticoagulant. And let me tell you, it's taken me a while to learn all this. And then zinc phosphide as bait, aluminum phosphide for fumigation are really the key ones that we use for rodents in almonds. As I say, I don't have a good sense when exactly these new restrictions will be hitting the labels. As I say, my understanding is EPA is supposed to finalize this next year, but they do need to get Fish and Wildlife's approval before they can do the next step. So with that, I just want to remind, we'll open it up to Q&A, and Sebastian will be helping me with this. And just a reminder for those who have the roof rat issues, sign up if you're interested in the bait stations over there in the corner. And with that.
All right. Thank you, Gabrielle. Sebastian here from them on board as well. We got 8 questions. Some of those questions were before your talks or during your talks, so you answered some of the questions. But I think it's still worth to ask them so you can emphasize or dig a little bit further on the topic. So let's start with the DPR. So with the DPR taking away so many tools from our toolbox, what are they doing to be adding new tools to allow us to take care of the squirrels and rats that are taking over with all the abandoned orchards?
A nice, easy question.
Is this testing? Great, okay. I'll just move this closer. Yeah, to reiterate, as currently drafted, FGAR use, so difascinone, as we've been speaking to, use would be maintained without duration restriction in agriculture. But we also expect the sustainable rodent management training and plan to provide support for folks as well, providing really valuable insight and knowledge into alternatives there.
Thank you. So the next question, is the Almond Board funding any studies on ground squirrel control?
Not currently. So currently we're funding some work on the rat problems, but not currently on ground squirrels. We have in the past, but it's been a while.
Okay. One of the keys to squirrel control is coordination with neighbors. Can you expand on that?
Yeah, I mean, that gets at this whole concept of reinvasion, right? And if you think back to when I was talking a little bit about burrow destruction, you know, the importance of burrow destruction comes in part because there probably wasn't great coordination with neighbors and they still have, you know, abundant ground squirrel populations. So to the extent that growers can work together on managing, you know, any of these species, whether it be ground squirrels, rats, et cetera, you're going to get better results because you're controlling them over a larger area, which slows down that ability to repopulate those areas that you've effectively managed. So to the extent that you can work with your neighbors to manage these species collectively, you will see the benefits of that. It's just, it can be challenging, obviously, because not everybody has the same perception of importance of, you know, some of these different problems.
Thank you, Roger. Another one for you here, rats. Can you discuss the scale of the roof rat problem? How do you think it will continue to evolve? Is it going to get worse before it gets better? What does your crystal ball say?
Boy, that's the million-dollar question, isn't it? And you know, I don't know that there's any way that we can know if it's going to get worse or better. As far as the scale of the problem itself, you know, it really blew up last year. Pretty substantial damage associated with rats, particularly in certain orchards and in certain areas. However, in going out and looking at some of these sites, I think a lot of these sites we're seeing a reduction in damage that from where we saw really extensive damage the year prior. But I think we're also seeing the rats moving into new areas where they weren't found previously. So it's difficult to say, how that problem is going to change over time because it's so new. I don't think we have enough years into this to understand what the long-term scale of this problem is going to be. I will say, rats aren't entirely new in these orchard systems. I mean, when I was doing work on rat control in almond orchards 10 to 15 years ago, when they had, fairly extensive rat problems in a more localized area at that particular point. And then it kind of dissipated a little bit. And then, here within the last year or two, it kind of exploded again. And so, we're not really sure entirely what some of those driving factors are. Probably some of it is abandoned acreage that's out there, which has led to a proliferation of rat problems. Some of it may be ideal weather conditions for the rats. We've had pretty wet years, particularly when you combine that fact with some of these abandoned orchards, which allowed for a little bit extra production in some of those sites than you might not have seen otherwise. That may have led to some increased issues. And I think that the change in aluminum phosphide usage, the new restriction on the category M caught some people off guard, and aluminum phosphide was really the primary tool that a lot of these growers were using for rat control that did have rats, and then they couldn't use it for a year, and I think that probably led to increased problems there too. So we had a lot of different factors that probably came into play that led to an increase in this population, and now it seems to be spreading a little bit. And that's a long-winded way of saying I don't really know the answer to that question. But there is some evidence to suggest that areas that had bad rat problems, that the numbers are starting to go down already. So hopefully it won't be a super bad problem for a really long period of time. But I wouldn't be shocked with the fact that you have rats moving into all these new areas that, you may very well have at least an established population in those areas longer term, and it becomes a problem that you have to deal with on an annual basis.
Okay, thank you. With the pressure exhaust machines, how effective are they for ground squirrels when in hibernation? When is the most effective time to get the 90 to 100% efficacy?
Okay. Yeah, with those pressurized exhaust machines, like with any burrow fumigant, they will not be effective if you use them during hibernation. So you need to wait until the animals are active before you start a fumigation program. That being said, the best time to use it is shortly after they emerge from hibernation. Now, ground squirrels hibernate differently in different parts of the state, and it varies from year to year. So, if you go all the way down into San Diego County, they're not going to hibernate at all. If you go, up in, the foothills, 3,000 feet where you've got ground squirrels, they're going to hibernate for a longer period of time than they would in some other areas. So, where they're found and general climatic patterns from year to year will influence that. That being said, and to complicate it too is the fact that, some of the juveniles, even during the normal hibernation period, will come up above ground and be active for periods of time, in part because they don't have enough fat stores to be able to sleep off the entire winter. So people will sometimes get confused. They'll be like, oh, I see, ground squirrels running around now or in January, so they must not be hibernating. But reality is a lot of them probably are hibernating and a few of them are not. So you do have to wait until they're active. So usually what we're doing is just doing some general observation for ground squirrel activity. When you start to see a real uptick in activity, we usually recommend waiting about 2 weeks. We wait that extra time period because some of the ground squirrels probably will be sleeping it off for a little longer period of time, particularly the females oftentimes do. So then, once we've seen the activity uptick, we wait a couple of weeks. Now is the time we can go in and start a fumigation plan, because at that time, we're going to assume that all of them are active, and we're going to assume we have a good normal precipitation year where we have good soil moisture. But soil moisture is always the key aspect, which means that you can do burrow fumigation later in the year too if you have sufficient soil moisture from irrigation. It's just, our irrigation's pretty targeted these days. Sometimes we don't get really good soil saturation necessarily, at least from the perspective of a fumigation program later in the year. So it's usually better to time it with the natural precipitation events that we get.
Okay. Here's another friendly question to DPR. Has DPR considered the results of the ban of ARs and the explosion of rats in large California cities, leading into public health concerns and business closures?
Can you repeat after cities for me? Sorry.
Yeah. Has DPR considered the results of the ban of ARs and the explosion of rats in large California cities, leading into public health concerns and business closures in their analysis?
DPR is tracking those situations, but for our rodenticide regulation draft mitigations, we are balancing public health concerns with maintaining the important AR tools that we need. So just to speak to that a little bit more specifically, we have an exemption explicitly for state public health officers and local public health officers for urgent public health needs.
So it has been considered.
Can I just add, the ban is actually from the state legislature. It was not from DPR. So just to be very clear where it came from.
Thanks for the clarification there. Are sterilant baits getting any potential future regulatory pressures?
Yeah, so I think the question was about chemosterilants and their potential use to help manage rodent populations. There is currently one product available for rats in ag settings, which could be used. It has not been tested in orchard-type settings yet. I will also mention quickly that it's not available for other rodents, so things like gophers, ground squirrels, et cetera. There are no registered products for those species. But for rats, specifically roof rats, there are. One of the hurdles, though, with the use of a chemosterilant, particularly in like an orchard setting, an ag production setting, is that what that's going to do, it's basically birth control, right? It's birth control for rodents. And so what it's going to do is potentially keep them from reproducing, but it's not going to get rid of the rats out there, right? So you're basically going to rely on them to die off of natural causes over time. So that means you're going to continue to incur that damage for that period of time, which is oftentimes not what the grower is looking for, right? So there are some potential limitations from that perspective, at least in production ag situations. But again, we really haven't done a lot of, there hasn't been any testing on this product. And another one of the challenges of it is that the product that is currently registered, my understanding is that they have to be feeding on it constantly. So it's like human birth control where you have to, constantly be taking it, which means you have to be running bait stations constantly with the product out there and the rats consuming it. So that makes it a little bit challenging too. But I guess I'll just leave it that there's increasing work in this area, and hopefully we'll have some better options on that front in the future.
Are we good with time? I have more questions here. One more? Okay. If we promote wildfire predators for rodent control, like owls or raptor boxes or perches, what should we do with respect to baiting toxins? How do we mitigate negative impacts on non-target wildfire? Should we discontinue toxic baiting? And I know you guys touched on this, but maybe an opportunity to put your key messages again.
Yeah, so correct me if excuse me, correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe the question centered on how to utilize rodenticides with a barn owl program as well to manage rodents, right?
Yeah.
Okay. So no, that's a good question. There is certainly the potential for secondary exposure if utilizing ARs in an area where you're also trying to utilize barn owls to help manage those rodent populations. Some of it is species specific, right? So if you're using anticoagulants to manage ground squirrels, barn owls aren't really feeding on ground squirrels, and so probably a much greater chance that those will be able to used in concert without any substantial negative consequences. Secondly, another thing that you could consider is utilizing something other than ARs if you're incorporating barn owls too. And zinc phosphide is a great example of that. Zinc phosphide is a rodenticide that has very low secondary exposure risk associated with it. So there are ways that you can incorporate some of those products in with a barn owl management program too. So there's always a lot of things to think about on that front. You could look at, carcass searches and carcass removal too, if that's something that you wanted to engage in. But we've done, a fair amount of work on some of these areas. For example, for ground squirrel control, I can tell you that 80 to 90% of the ground squirrels die below ground within burrow systems, which reduces secondary exposure risk there. And, we've looked at, the other thing too is we've looked at the validity or the value, I guess should we say, of some of these carcass searches. And it's challenging, right? It's hard to find the carcasses out there. We just completed some work this summer where we planted dead ground squirrels out there on the landscape and did various different types of carcass searches. And a lot of cases we're only finding, 20%, 30% of the carcasses that were out there. And we were, specifically set up to try to find them, right? So it's challenging to do that. So that's a potential limitation for carcass searches. But I do think that there are ways that you can incorporate rodenticides and biocontrol into successful management programs, but it does require some thought and care.
So with that, I want to thank our speakers today and thank you for attending. And again, if roof rats are problems, sign up for bait stations. And we now have a break and come back, I believe, here for our pest management session from our traditional pests or actually new pests of Carpophilus, red blotch, and just disease management.
Can
Yeah.
I add one thing in here real quick? I got a mic?
Yeah.
I am still conducting work on rats in almond orchards. And so if anybody has orchards that have abundant rat populations, and we do really need sites with a lot of rats. So just a few, probably not as helpful. But if anybody has any orchard sites with lots of rats and they want somebody to come out and do some research on it, please reach out to me. Thank you.
Thank you.